Hello everyone and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. Kicking off straight away with very special thanks to a couple of new patrons, Kev Brooks and Paul Kyle. Thank you both very much indeed. They have joined up and become patrons via our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/The History Network, where you can find out all about that. If you haven't become a patron yet and would like to, then we would very much welcome your patronage. Just go along to Patreon, patreon.com/The History Network and find out about it there. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 27, Episode 5, The British Campaign in Egypt, 1801, Part 2. This episode was written by Simon Quinn. Simon is a postdoctoral research fellow in history at the University of York. He has recently completed a PhD studying the lives of British soldiers on campaign in Egypt in 1801. We pick up the story of the British attack on the French in Egypt. General Abercrombies' men have achieved an amphibious assault landing, and the French had been unable to throw them back in the sea. The British now occupied the tip of the Aboukir peninsula, directly opposite French forces. The flanks of both armies were secured by the Mediterranean Sea on one side and the marshy ground of the dried-up Lake Mareotis on the other. Following the landing on the 8th of March, the British built defences, heaved supplies ashore and buried the dead. A short action took place on the 13th of March, during which the British repulsed an attack by French cavalry and horse artillery. After this, the British paused to consider their next move. The lack of cavalry made a rapid advance impossible, so they occupied a natural defensive position of broken sandhills, crowned by a collection of Roman ruins. In Cairo, news of the British landing stirred Menu into action. If the British could be beaten, they would be trapped on the Aboukir Peninsula and forced to surrender, which would tip the balance firmly in France's favour as the peace negotiations progressed. Menu arrived at Aboukir on the 20th of March, bringing reinforcements with him. The French army at Aboukir now numbered 11,600, of whom 1,460 were cavalry. Scarcely giving his men time to rest from their long march from Cairo, Menu ordered an attack before dawn on the following morning, 21st of March. Many recognised that the Roman ruins atop the sandhills on the British right flank were the linchpin of their defences. If the French could dislodge the British from these ruins, the battle would be won. Menu's plan was simple but risky. A cavalry attack on the British left would act as a diversion, while the bulk of French infantry and artillery would assault the British right. Lacking the numerical superiority normally required for this kind of assault, the French were relying on surprise. Inexplicably, the diversion against the British left was to begin simultaneously with the real attack instead of preceding it, thus not allowing time to deceive the British. This was not helped by the lack of detail in Menu's orders, which left the French senior officers unclear over their objectives. In the British lines, the night passed fairly peacefully until 4 a.m, when ripples of musket fire broke out on the left flank as the French diversionary attack opened fire. Sporadic small arms fire was common among nervous and tired sentries on both sides, hence the officers on duty for the night were not overly concerned. Within a few minutes, a furious cannonade of musket and artillery fire boomed across the peninsula from the right flank, coupled with the drums and chants of Vive République that declared a major assault was imminent. Abercrombie and his staff immediately recognised the attack would fall on the right. The French diversion had failed. For the next 4 hours, a vicious struggle took place around the Roman ruins on the British right flank, as waves of French infantry appeared out of the darkness to be fired on at point-blank range. The British posted in the ruins were practically cut off from the rest of the army as the French wheeled around the ancient Roman structures and attacked from the front and behind. John Moore, the commander of the right flank, was hit in the leg in the opening stages of battle. Unable to walk, he directed his men on horseback and proved a critical figure in organising the defence. Successive French attacks were beaten back with heavy casualties. French survivors from each assault broke into bands of skirmishers who poured fire onto the British as another attack advanced. Regiments from the British Reserve were quickly dispatched to help relieve the pressure on Moore and his beleaguered men. At their head was Abercrombie, who, much to the chagrin of his staff, marched into the fiercest fighting. By 6 a.m. there was enough light for the British gunboats off the shore to fire accurately on the French, adding to the carnage. Round shot from one of these gunboats struck General François Lanus, commander of the French attack on the Roman ruins. His leg had been shattered and he quickly bled to death. At this point, Menou should have realised the battle was lost. His men had failed to take the ruins and had suffered heavy casualties. This failure and the death of several commanding officers had thrown the French into disarray. In this desperate situation, Menou ordered César Antoine Roaz and his brigade of mountain dragoons to attack the British posted in the ancient Roman buildings. Roaz was horrified. Although not yet 40, he had 23 years of experience in the cavalry. He recognised that without fresh infantry to support the attack, his men would certainly be wiped out. Roaz's remonstrations were in vain, and he could not dissuade his commander. Within a few minutes, Roaz led his cavalry into the attack. They swirled around the ruins, taking fire from those within, unable to get close enough to the men behind the crumbling walls. The British had not expected a cavalry attack, and one of the reserve regiments was cut to pieces by French sabres. Close by, Abercrombie was surrounded by enemy cavalry. The ageing general was slashed across the chest and thrown from his horse. Fortunately, Abercrombie's assailants were whittled down by small arms fire and could not land a killing blow. As the surviving cavalrymen trickled back to their lines, it was clear that the battle had been won by the British. Sporadic skirmishing continued as the bulk of the French forces pulled back from artillery range. Finally, by 10 a.m., all fire had ceased. The swathes of crumpled and mangled bodies around the Roman ruins told the story of the battle. 1,436 casualties had been sustained by the British. These were concentrated in the reserve regiments that had been charged by the French cavalry. Approximately 1,700 French dead and wounded were counted. Among them was the body of General Roaz. Although bloodied and beaten, Abercrombie appeared well. The slash to his chest had left bruising, but had not broken the skin. As he watched the final stages of the battle, one of his orderlies noticed that the general had been shot in the thigh, a wound Abercrombie had failed to mention. He insisted on remaining in the field and refused medical attention. After half an hour, and increasingly pale, Abercrombie was no longer able to stand and was carried from the field. A surgeon attempted to extract the musket ball, only to find that it was lodged in the hip joint. Gangrene set in, and on the 28th of March, Ralph Abercrombie died. John Moore's wound was less serious. He suffered an infection but survived, and would return to his duties a month later. Added to the wounded were the increasing numbers of sick. Thousands of flies and mosquitoes fed on both the living and the dead, easily spreading disease among the exhausted and dehydrated soldiers. 6 days after the battle, the rank and file of the British Army had been reduced to 12,697, and there were 4,501 sick and wounded. Abercrombie's death had a great impact on the army. The commander seemed to have been both genuinely liked and respected. William Thornton, an army surgeon, wrote, "His loss was a severe one. His death was universally mourned. He was beloved by the troops, for his courage was their pride and example." While his loss was felt keenly, some thought the general's recklessness had brought about his death. General John Doyle wrote, "The rashness of his gallantry often impelled him into situations where one never thought of looking for the commander-in-chief of an army." Abercrombie's successor as commander-in-chief was Major-General Sir John Healy Hutchinson. At 44 years old, he was a veteran of several campaigns and an intelligent military theorist. Abercrombie had valued his judgment and thought of him as an able second-in-command. Unlike Abercrombie, Hutchinson was an unpopular leader. He was impolite and possessed a violent temper, leading him to be disliked by many of the senior officers in Egypt. Alexander Cochrane, a naval captain, confided in a letter that "neither army nor navy have much confidence in General Hutchinson, who, though possessing many good qualities, has not those necessary for the commander of an army." Hutchinson ordered the peninsula fortified, and soon the army inhabited a formidable position. On the 26th of March, unexpected reinforcements were received in the form of 3,600 Turks, led by the Captain Pasha, the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Navy. Despite this, the British remained considerably outnumbered. In relative terms, the numerical superiority of the French had actually increased since the British landing, but there was no reason to fear another French assault. Surprised and disappointed by his defeat, Menou ignored the pleas of his generals to launch another attack. Instead, he decided on a static defence, dividing his forces between Alexandria and Cairo. Menou hoped to buy enough time for the arrival of French reinforcements or news of the signing of a peace treaty. Menou's retreat behind the walls of Alexandria presented Hutchinson with a difficult decision. Should he remain at Alexandria to besiege the city, or advance to Cairo to link up with the Turkish army that was advancing on the capital from the desert? He chose to advance, but leaving Alexandria in the hands of the French posed enormous risks. Hutchinson had to divide his army, leaving 6,000 men under General Eyre Coote to maintain the siege at Alexandria, while he would lead 5,000 men to Cairo, alongside the Captain Pasha's Turkish detachment. Dividing the already outnumbered British army made the number of troops available to Hutchinson perilously small, and provided the French in Alexandria with an opportunity to break out and cut his tenuous supply lines. The decision to advance was met with severe, almost mutinous opposition from Hutchinson's subordinates. For many, the advance to Cairo was simply too risky. The Turkish army might be defeated before the British could assist, and even if Cairo surrendered, it might not be the decisive blow hoped for. It was safer to remain at Alexandria and ensure the surrender of the French garrison. A group of officers wrote to General Coote and John Moore asking for their cooperation in removing Hutchinson from command. The plan fell apart after Moore sternly refused to consider undermining his commander. To limit the risk of a French breakout from Alexandria, the British undertook an ingenious enterprise. On the 13th of April, they cut 2 deep canals through the Aboukir Peninsula, allowing seawater to flow through and fill up the previously dry Lake Mareotis. The position of the lake meant that, when full, Alexandria was positioned in the centre of a narrow isthmus. This enabled Coote's 6,000 men to easily defend themselves along a narrow front. It was now much harder for the French in Alexandria to escape the city without going through the British lines. With a secure foothold at Alexandria, the British advanced toward the mouth of the Nile. By the 10th of May, they had reached the Nile and forced the surrender of the French forts at Rosetta and Ramania. Following a brief skirmish, French forces retreated towards Cairo. Hutchinson led his army south along the banks of the Nile towards the Egyptian capital. In an attempt to curb the spread of illness, contact with the local inhabitants was limited. British troops were forbidden to enter any villages or housing. In spite of these precautions, sickness began to increase. 50 men per day were falling ill with dysentery or fever, but the worst widespread problem was Egyptian ophthalmia. This severe form of bacterial conjunctivitis had never been encountered before. It was highly infectious and capable of rendering its victims blind. Estimates vary, but more than half of the British Army suffered from ophthalmia to some degree during their service in Egypt. Accompanied by fever, and ophthalmia sufferers' eyelids commonly swell to such an extent they cannot be opened. The eyes become irritable, and any direct light causes pain. The main cycle of the disease usually passes in 2 weeks. The majority of British soldiers in Egypt recovered without medicine. However, there were numerous cases in which the inflammation lasted for months, and many of these unfortunates were permanently blinded in one or both eyes. Captain Exum Vincent recalled in gruesome detail the agony of several hundred men who were attended with the most excruciating torment. In the course of a few days the eyes became so inflamed and swelled as literally to burst in their sockets, and through this produced total blindness. The growing number of sick reduced Hutchinson's effective force to 4,000 men, too few to assault the walls of Cairo. Fortunately, the Turkish army, having marched from Jaffa, arrived at the outskirts of the Egyptian capital and camped alongside the British on the opposite bank of the Nile. Hutchinson spent several days in the Turkish camp discussing plans for the siege of Cairo with the Grand Vizier, the commander-in-chief of the Turkish army. The British were increasingly reliant on Turkish manpower, and Hutchinson hoped they would prove a reliable source. He was greatly disappointed. The Turks appeared so disorganised that their army resembled more a county fair than an army. Hutchinson declared despondently that it was the worst army that ever existed, and detested his dependence upon them. He wrote they were not even the shadow of an army. No dependence can be placed upon them. It is a most frightful experiment to act at all with them, and it is not by any means impossible that even in action they might be more mischievous to their friend than to their enemy. But bad as they are, they must be used. We have no other resource. With very few men on which he could rely, Hutchinson prepared for a difficult siege, and entertained little hope for success. Remarkably, on the 22nd of June, the day that the gun batteries for the siege were due to be completed, the gates of Cairo opened, and a French party emerged to discuss a surrender. Although the French garrison at Cairo possessed significantly more men and material than the British, they were completely demoralised. The French had not seen their homeland, nor their loved ones, for 3 years, and their correspondence show that they were thoroughly fed up of Egypt, with its hot, inhospitable climate and hostile Muslim inhabitants. For the duration of their occupation, French soldiers had treated Egyptian insurgents and Turkish soldiers with appalling cruelty. Perhaps the most infamous example of this was the massacre of approximately 4,000 unarmed Turkish prisoners at Jaffa in March 1799. The Egyptians and Turks responded in kind, torturing and mutilating any French soldiers they could get their hands on. During Hutchinson's advance on Cairo, the French surrendered to the British in their hundreds, preferring British protection to a grisly death at the hands of the Turks or local Egyptians. The commander of the Cairo garrison, General Augustin Daniel Belliard, had watched the British and Turkish armies construct their siege batteries and concluded that further resistance was pointless. He had heard nothing from the French in Alexandria since mid-May, the British having severed communications between Alexandria and Cairo. There was no reason for him to believe that the garrison at Alexandria still held out. Belliard decided he would negotiate while he still maintained a position of strength, and offered to surrender in return for repatriation to France. The British readily accepted, and the siege of Cairo ended before it began. On the 9th of July, the French evacuated Cairo in a cheerful procession. They had long wanted to go home, and the capitulation to the British made this possible. As the French marched out of the Egyptian capital, the British were stunned at the size of the garrison. Hutchinson had thought it to be no more than 5,000 men, but the real number was just under 14,000. With them, the French brought a considerable amount of loot and baggage, which should have been surrendered under the terms of the capitulation. Given the size of the force, Hutchinson thought it prudent not to enforce these terms too strictly, as long as he could get them out of Egypt. It is partly for this reason that, to this day, the Louvre and Musée de l'Armée in Paris boast a considerable number of Egyptian items in their collections. The British escorted the French to Rosetta, where they embarked on the British naval transports that sailed for France. On the 9th of August, the last of these convoys departed Egypt. The surrender of Cairo effectively sealed the fate of the French in Egypt. Menu's 11,000 men, of whom more than 2,000 were sick, were too few to cover the fortifications of Alexandria against a British force that now greatly outnumbered them. General Baird's Anglo-Indian force of 8,000 men finally arrived at Cairo on the 27th of August, only to be informed that the city had surrendered and the campaign was all but over. Menu knew that the game was up. He waited until the British concentrated their forces and prepared an assault before he surrendered on the 1st of September. The campaign in Egypt was over. The end of the fighting brought modest luxuries for the British soldiers. Earlier in June, as the terms for the surrender of Cairo were being negotiated, Hutchinson organised tour parties to the pyramids of Giza. For some of the rank and file, the pyramids were a revelation. Sergeant Robertson in the 92nd Gordon Highlanders wrote, "For my own part, not having read much and never having heard that there were such colossal structures in the world, I felt a degree of surprise, not unmingled with awe, on beholding the vastness and grandeur of what will ever continue to strike every spectator as the greatest effort of architectural labour that has yet been reared." Later in September, the soldiers explored the ancient structures dotted across the landscape of Alexandria. Pompey's Pillar, a giant Roman triumphal column on the outskirts of the city, was the most popular of these sites. This period of sightseeing was brief. From the 9th of September, the British Army began to embark on troop ships destined for redeployment in other theatres. A small garrison of 6,000 men remained at Alexandria until the last of the British forces evacuated in 1803. General Baird's Indian Army stayed with the garrison until June 1802, when they departed for India via Suez. As they embarked, the appearance of the men told of the adversity that they had endured over the past 6 months. The majority were clad in rags, having worn the same clothes day and night for 6 months. Many were suffering from ophthalmia and had bandages over their eyes. Added to this were the numerous blotches and swellings from the bites of mosquitoes and spiders and the sting of scorpions. They left behind 633 men who had been killed in action, and at least twice as many had died of their wounds or disease. Of the 3,058 wounded, many were permanently disabled owing to the high risk of infection. The French, by comparison, embarked with 27,000 men. Some 4,000 had been killed or died of disease since the British landing in March. Although the British had won an important victory, the campaign seems to have been quickly forgotten in Britain, perhaps because the news of the victory arrived too late to have an impact on the peace negotiations. Napoleon, with prior knowledge of the fall of Alexandria, persuaded British negotiators into signing the preliminary articles of peace the day before news of the victory arrived in Britain. Yet the British had not fought in vain. They had removed the French threat to India and had won their first victory against a veteran French army. Historians often emphasise the poor morale and homesickness of the French as the decisive factor in the campaign and fail to give credit to the British commanders for their achievements. Abercrombie had thoroughly prepared his men for their task and instilled in them a confidence that laid a foundation for future victories. His leadership has been compared with a later British commander of greater fame, Bernard Montgomery. Both Abercrombie and Montgomery restored the confidence of their army during combat in Egypt. The importance of the victory in Egypt on the morale of the army can be clearly seen through the actions and words of British commanders who directed subsequent battles. On the 21st of August 1808, near Vimeiro in Portugal, many of the men who had served in Egypt faced the French again. Just before the advancing French columns marched within musket range, one of Abercrombie's old staff officers, Brigadier General Robert Anstruther, called out to his men, "Remember, my lads, the glorious 21st March in Egypt. This day must be another glorious 21st. Today, the British campaign in Egypt is best remembered for its cultural contribution. Under the terms of the surrender at Cairo, the French reluctantly handed over a number of Egyptian artefacts they had collected during their occupation. One of these objects held a unique importance. It was a slab of black basalt, on one side of which were 3 inscriptions in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. This slab would become known as the Rosetta Stone and proved the key to deciphering the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. To this day, the Rosetta Stone sits on display at the British Museum. On its left side, one can still see the faintly carved words, "Captured in Egypt by the British Army, 1801. Well, thank you, Simon, for that fantastic two-parter. The British campaign in Egypt, 1801. Thanks for writing it for us. We really do appreciate it. If you'd like to write a script for us, drop us a line with your ideas. If you're happy for others to write the scripts and would just like to continue listening as a patron of the podcast, then pop along to patreon.com/The History Network and join our Patreon campaign there. We really, really do appreciate every one of you. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Simon Quinn, read by Nick Barker.